Okay, I am back after a long time to this section on new findings in climate change, where I put out podcasts that are based on new papers, reports, newspaper articles, and so on. This is a very nice report called New Energy Outlook India that was put out in 2023 by Bloomberg NEF, which is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, very commercial operation outfit, research wing, which puts out nice reports, but you cannot use them without prior consent. So I have sent them my email as required. If this is posted on my channel, then you can assume that I got the permit or that they didn't respond. So I decided that maybe they don't care enough about a poor professor posting their report on YouTube. Mr. Bloomberg, I'm a big fan. Keep doing a good charitable work and keep helping democracy, and let me use this, so don't come after me, okay? So the report has 7 sections. I won't obviously go through all of them. We'll just look at summary and key policy recommendations. If you want to go into further details, there is the introduction, which looks at the context and emissions and abatement, energy trends in India, power sector, what India is doing in terms of installed capacity and renewable capacity and dispatchable capacity and flexibility, power grids, all the good things, and what it is doing about hydrogen and carbon capture and the end-use sectors like industry, transport, and buildings. There are also sections on fuel demand and investment, but those I will skip, and as I said, I'll just look at these key findings of the energy transition scenario and key findings of the net zero scenario and some policy considerations. Maybe I'll finish this in one podcast, or maybe not, but let's read carefully. Anyways, thank you, Mr. Bloomberg, again. Section 1, Summary and Key Policy Recommendations. India's transition to a diversified and low-carbon energy system is already underway. India is doing very well in terms of deploying solar and wind, and of course still burning a lot of coal, unfortunately, but driven by supportive national policies and favorable economics, the transition to diversified and low-carbon energy system is underway. As we said, the national and state governments, businesses and industries, research centers and innovators now have the opportunity to accelerate the deployment of established decarbonization technologies and the development of others to reach net zero. India committed to net zero by 2070, so obviously it has to make progress. It's just appointed a committee to start charting out the pathways as well, and I have a whole section on net zero pathways and so on that you can look up. This report explores India's energy transition pathways based on the two scenarios developed in Bloomberg and NEF's New Energy Outlook 2022, the economic transition scenario without emissions constraints, and the net zero scenario subject to a carbon budget consistent with the Paris Agreement goal, that is 2 degrees C by 2100 with 67% probability. But you can go and look at all the report if you want more details. Using these scenarios, here we explore the implications for India's power, industry, transport and building sectors and chart out the investments and policies needed to help India achieve net zero emissions. It must be on a pathway, and there will be key time horizons like 2030, 2040 and so on, where some monitoring, reporting and evaluation will be needed to look at the nationally determined contribution commitments to Paris Agreement as well as the pathways to net zero, right? This is for everybody, not just for India. So here we'll look at solar capacity values in direct current unless significantly mentioned, mentioned as alternating current. The economic transition scenario ETS, I said energy transition, but that's economic transition scenario, is BNEF's Baseline assessment of how energy sector might evolve as a result of cost-based technology changes. So you're not chasing net zero, but you're just chasing cost optimality, covering the power, transport, industry, and buildings as before. This explorative scenario developed for the New Energy Outlook employs a combination of near-term policies and market analysis, least cost modeling, consumer uptake, and trend-based analysis to describe the deployment and diffusion of commercially available technologies in the absence of new policy regimes and uncover the underlying economic fundamentals of the energy transition. It is consistent with a 2.6 degree global warming outcome as mapped out now into the future by 2100. So obviously above the 2 degree C goal of the Paris Agreement. BNF's base case scenario for India shows the energy related transitions rising by 21% between 2022 and 2050. Let's read the different sectors. As we mentioned, power, transport, industry, buildings. Power, it sees India's power sector being driven mostly by renewables. Falling solar and energy storage costs continue to put pressure on the country's aging coal fleet, which today remains the backbone of the power mix. As power demand rises sharply in India, in fact last year it rose by 9% because of various factors, including the tremendous warming we are having in 2023-2024. So far, I'm recording this in July 2024. So as power demand rises sharply in India, a mix of competitive renewables balanced with flexible generation technologies emerges as the lowest cost portfolio to reliably keep the lights on. Total solar, wind and batteries installation reach, so total wind and batteries installation reach 2,165 gigawatts by mid-century, so it's DC here, more than 20 times as much as in 2021. That's quite a jump by mid-century. Okay, non-fossil fuel sources form 80% of the electricity generation in 2050. 80% coming from non-fossil fuel sources. As a result, emissions from the power sector fall 29% from 1,385 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2021 to 983 MTCO2 in 2050, the biggest contributor to India's economy-wide emissions reduction during this period. Maybe you're not impressed, but 29% drop while staying on the economic development pathway and keeping in mind that this is not CO2 equivalent, so other greenhouse gases are not being included, but we have to do our part for the global mission on mitigation, but India also has to develop economically for its people. Fossil fuels, the use of fossil fuels continues to rise under our base case, reaching 36,543 petajoules by 2050 compared to 30,448 petajoules in 2021. Coal peaks at in 2037, reaching 1,098 million metric tons of coal and falling to 970 by 2050. So significant amount still remains as part of the power portfolio. A 20% jump from 2021, so it will actually be going up. Oil sees a similar trend, peaking in 2038 at 270 million tons of oil equivalent, MTOE. So other energies will be mixed when you say oil equivalent, falling to 249 MTOE by 2050, 28% higher than 2021. Gas use continues to decline to 2050, falling 6% from its low base in 2021 of 52 billion cubic meters. The relevance of gas in electricity generation mix, which was at a high of an 11% share in 2000, falls to 1% by 2050. Just, I'm mentioning a lot of numbers, I'm reading off a lot of numbers. If you want the details, you can go back to the report, which you can subscribe and then download. And you are not supposed to digitize like this without prior consent, which I have asked for and waiting for it as I'm recording this. Transport. Under the economic transition scenario, electric two-wheeler and three-wheeler sales are set to reach more than 24.4 million and 2.7 million units respectively in 2050, compared to only 233,971 and 384,063 units in 2021. So that's quite a jump. Despite an increased adoption of electric vehicles from the 2023's in road transport, direct transport related emissions from road, aviation, shipping and rail sectors rise by 38% to 427 million tons of CO2 by 2050 from 309 million tons of CO2 in 2021. So that is a moderate increase over this time horizon, but it's still an increase. Continuously rising demand for air travel, coupled with the relatively poor competitiveness of clean fuel, or electrification based on current technology costs, means emissions from aviation rise eightfold by 2050. This, of course, is a scenario where you are looking at what's happening now, and if a game changer comes along, India will not slow down on the aviation industry growth, because people are getting richer, middle class is growing, people are flying around domestically and internationally, so that's not going to stop. So only thing that can, bring down emissions is, of course, switch to more fuel efficient or renewable energies for aviation, which every country in the world is struggling with. So industry, BNF finds that emissions from steel, aluminum, petrochemicals and cement continue to rise under the base case. Steel, India's largest emitting industrial subsector, sees emissions almost triple between 2021 and 2050 to 948 million tons of CO2 from 351 million tons of CO2. Everybody in the world is struggling with this, even though there are technologies like green steel and so on that will hopefully be transferred to countries like India for the global good. Coal consumption in steel making sees a similar growth, which is unfortunate, reaching 399 million metric tons of coal by mid-century. Coal use in cement industry, the second largest emitting subsector, grows fivefold to 83 million tons of CO2 by 2050 compared to 2021. Emissions from the cement sector rise by 5 times and reach 289 million tons of CO2 by mid-century. India and China continue to grow. Infrastructure is a big part of it, including residential, commercial, roads, bridges, and so on. So cement use is going to keep going up, but the rest of the world is also struggling with reducing emissions from CO2 from cement production and steel production. Finally, investment. Total investment in India's energy system is nearly $7.6 trillion between 2022 and 2050 in the economic transition scenario, which is a scenario, so you have to remember, representing $262 billion each year on average. The rising uptake of the electric vehicles in this period represents a significant investment opportunity amounting to $1.5 trillion. So if you can invest, make money on economic transition and also net zero scenario, then obviously it's a good way to make money. As India's power system grows while decarbonizing between 2022 and 2050, $1.3 trillion invested on the power grid is invested on the power grid, and $1.8 trillion are invested on power capacity. This amounts to 106 billion per year on average invested in power capacity and the grid to 2050. Capital investments for fossil fuel processes add up to $1.2 trillion by 2050, representing 16% of the overall investments. Okay, so we'll come back and look at key findings of the net zero scenario. Obviously a lot of numbers, but they are important and interesting, but you have to remember they are based on scenarios, and you don't always know what game changer may come along, what war may break out, how India may get cornered between competing interests of US and China, or how sanctions may prohibit India from getting not just energy but technology and materials from somewhere, and so on and so forth. So scenarios are scenarios, so you have to take them with a grain of salt. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best is the mantra we have to follow. Come back and see you in the next podcast on net zero scenario. Okay.